2. There are moments in life when silence feels louder than words, when a single glance across a crowded room carries the weight of centuries of pain. This story begins in such a moment, one that unfolded at a dinner table, where the air was thick, not with laughter or warmth, but with an unspoken truth that no one wanted to acknowledge. It wasn't just a family dinner. It wasn't just another evening of food being passed from hand to hand. No, it was the stage for an unveiling, a confrontation that carried within it scars far older than anyone in the room. A story of betrayal, not only between husband and wife, but between generations who had tried to bury wounds that never truly healed. The man, sitting at the table, had been carrying a secret. Not his own, but one that belonged to the person he trusted most. A secret intertwined with pain, deception, and something far more insidious than infidelity. It was a truth about the world we live in, about how cruelty often hides in plain sight, dressed in the clothes of everyday life. And yet, even as he looked around the table at the faces that had laughed with him, loved him, and judged him, he knew tonight was different. Tonight, the hidden would no longer stay hidden. Tonight, the quiet storm would break, and every person present would be forced to reckon with what they had ignored for far too long. This wasn't just about a marriage. This wasn't just about betrayal. This was about a deeper injustice, one rooted in the way society treats those who are different, those who are marginalized, those whose very existence is questioned. It was about prejudice dressed as respectability, cruelty disguised as love, and racism lingering like poison in the veins of a family that refused to admit it was there. The man's heart pounded in his chest. The walls seemed to close in. His hands trembled, not with fear of the confrontation itself, but with the weight of knowing what it would mean once the truth was spoken aloud. For once a truth like this is revealed, there is no return to normal. And so, as the silverware clinked, as voices murmured about small, meaningless details, and as smiles tried to paint over the cracks of broken trust, one man prepared to shatter it all. He would not do it out of anger alone, but out of a need for justice, for dignity, for a reckoning that could no longer be postponed. This was not merely the story of a dinner gone wrong, too. It was the story of how deeply racism can intertwine with betrayal, how prejudice can hide behind love, and how one night can change everything forever.
Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to TrueHeart Tales, where every story is crafted to make you feel, reflect, and see the world a little differently. These stories aren't just for entertainment. They're mirrors of life, carrying lessons too often ignored. Don't miss the next one. The story begins in the quiet heart of a suburban neighborhood where houses sat neatly side by side, their lawns trimmed and their windows glowing with warm light in the evenings. It was the kind of place where outsiders might think everything was perfect. Families smiling on their porches, neighbors greeting each other politely, children riding bikes down smooth, quiet streets. But beneath the surface of such neighborhoods, there are often cracks. Cracks in families, in marriages, and in the values people claim to live by. At the center of this story was a man named Marcus. He was in his late 30s, calm in demeanor, with a patience that had carried him through many storms. Marcus had always been the kind of man who worked hard, loved deeply, and tried to see the good in people, even when they gave him little reason to. He was respected in his community, though often in the restrained, distant way people offer respect to someone they still don't fully accept. His wife, Claire, was different. She was charming, well-spoken, and from the outside, they seemed like the perfect couple. But while Marcus had always known that life carried difficulties, He never expected that the deepest wound would come from the person he trusted most. Their marriage looked stable to the world, but cracks had been forming in silence. Small betrayals, whispered lies, and behaviors that Marcus had brushed aside in the hope of preserving peace. The truth, however, has a way of demanding attention, and the truth Marcus was carrying was heavier than anyone at that dinner table could imagine. Claire had betrayed him, not only with lies about her fidelity, but with something far worse. The way her actions echoed the very prejudice Marcus had endured for much of his life. Her betrayal was not simply about love lost. It was about dignity stripped away. Because when infidelity is tied to racism, it cuts deeper than a broken vow. It becomes an attack on identity, on humanity itself. The family dinner had been planned for weeks. Marcus knew every person who would be sitting there. Claire's parents, who had always treated him with polite distance, her siblings, who never failed to make small comments that reminded Marcus he was different, and relatives who smiled at him with their mouths, but never with their eyes. For years, Marcus had told himself it was easier to let it slide, to swallow the discomfort, to be the bigger person. But this time, the wound was too raw to ignore. As the evening approached, Marcus replayed the past months in his mind. The late nights when Claire wouldn't come home on time. The excuses that grew thinner with each passing week. The subtle change in how she looked at him as if she was somewhere else, even when sitting beside him. And then the discovery that shattered what little peace he had left, proof that her betrayal was only physical, but steeped in a cruel irony. She had risked his health, his trust, and his very place in the family by stepping outside their marriage. But worse than the act itself was the way she excused it, as though Marcus should have expected it, as though the stereotypes whispered about him and others like him were justification enough. That realization cut through him sharper than any knife. So, as he dressed for the dinner that night, Marcus wasn't thinking about revenge in the way movies portray it. He wasn't planning an outburst or dramatic theatrics. Instead, he carried with him the quiet resolve of a man who has been underestimated for too long. He knew that exposing the truth would not only reveal Claire's betrayal, but also force the entire family to confront something they had avoided for years. The racism that lived in their own home. The dining table was long, polished, and elegant. Plates were neatly arranged, silverware shining under the soft light of the chandelier. The family gathered, exchanging small talk about work, vacations, and trivial matters. They laughed, but Marcus could feel the undercurrent, that subtle tension he had always felt in this house. The unspoken divide that no one dared to acknowledge. And yet, tonight was different. Tonight, Marcus wasn't going to stay silent. Tonight, he would peel back the layer of civility and reveal what lay beneath, because this was not just about one marriage, one betrayal, or one family's discomfort. It was about every time he had been told to just ignore it, every time he had been treated as less, every time his pain was dismissed as an overreaction. What he carried into that room was more than anger. It was history, generations of struggle compressed into the beating of his heart. And though the people around that table thought they were about to share a meal, Marcus knew they were about to witness a reckoning. The knives were sharp, the plates spotless, the wine poured out, but none of them knew that before the night ended, the table would no longer symbolize togetherness. It would symbolize truth, shattered illusions, and the breaking of silence that had lasted far too long. The sound of silverware against porcelain filled the room, a hollow rhythm masking the storm building in Marcus's chest. He watched the faces around the table, each one smiling, laughing, pretending. It was a performance they all knew well, the act of normalcy. Yet beneath the surface of their polite conversation, Marcus could feel the undercurrent of judgment, the subtle ways in which he had always been marked as an outsider. Claire sat beside him, her posture perfect, her expression carefully arranged. To anyone else, she looked calm and composed, but Marcus had spent years studying her face. He saw the flicker of unease in her eyes every time their gazes met. She knew what was coming. She could sense it, like an actor realizing the curtain was about to fall before the play had reached its end. The dinner began as it always did, with small talk that carried no weight. Her father discussed his golf game. Her mother complimented the roast. Her siblings bickered lightly about trivial matters. On the surface, it was ordinary, but Marcus felt every word as if it were a stone pressing against his chest. He couldn't focus on the food before him, couldn't taste anything. The bitterness he carried was stronger than any flavor the meal could offer. He thought about the years he had spent in this family, always careful with his words, always conscious of the looks, the whispers, the moments when his presence seemed tolerated rather than welcomed. He remembered the jokes disguised as light-hearted, the questions that carried hidden barbs, the compliments that weren't compliments at all. He had swallowed them all, convincing himself that love meant endurance. But what love was left now? What love could survive the discovery of betrayal? Not only of vows, but of respect, of dignity. Marcus could still feel the sting of that moment, weeks ago, when the truth revealed itself. He had gone searching, not because he didn't trust, but because something inside him had changed. He had seen messages, overheard whispers, pieced together a truth he had hoped never to face. Claire hadn't just strayed. She had done so in a way that mocked everything he had endured as a black man in a family that never fully accepted him. The whispers of stereotypes, the cruel caricatures he had lived against all his life, now tangled in her betrayal. She hadn't just hurt him, she had weaponized the very prejudice that had followed him since childhood. That was the truth Marcus carried with him now, heavier than any secret, sharper than any knife. As the meal continued, Marcus's silence grew louder. Every pause in conversation, every clink of the glass seemed to echo his restraint. The family noticed. They exchanged glances, subtle shifts in posture, uneasy laughter. Claire's hand twitched beside his, as if she wanted to reach for him, but knew better. She had already crossed a line she could never uncross. The storm built slowly. Marcus felt it in his chest, in the way his breaths came shorter, in the way his palms pressed into his thighs to keep them from shaking. He thought about leaving, about walking away and letting silence consume him as it always had. But the weight of history pressed too hard. This wasn't just about him. It was about every time someone like him had been told to stay quiet, to endure, to forgive what should never be forgiven. The conversations around him began to falter. Claire's mother asked him a question he barely heard. Something trivial about work, about life, about details that no longer mattered. Marcus nodded, offered a polite answer, and returned to his silence. The unease grew. It was as if everyone at the table could feel that something had shifted, that the ground beneath their performance of unity was beginning to crack. Marcus stared at his plate, untouched, his reflection faint in the polished silver of the knife. He thought about how long he had tried to be what they wanted, how long he had forced himself into a mold that never fit. Tonight, that mold would shatter. Tonight, the silence would end. And yet, even as his resolve hardened, he felt the familiar ache of doubt. Would they even care? Would they dismiss him, as they always had? Would his pain be minimized, twisted into something smaller than it was? That fear pressed against him, threatening to steal his courage. But then he looked at Claire, at the woman who had once promised him love and partnership, and saw not remorse but fear of exposure. That was when he knew he couldn't carry it any longer. He couldn't protect the comfort of those who had never protected his dignity. The truth had to come out. The dinner table, once a place of polite performance, now sat on the edge of collapse. Every laugh sounded hollow, every smile forced, every word meaningless. The storm Marcus carried had reached its peak, and soon it would break. Because there comes a moment when silence is more painful than truth. And Marcus had reached that moment. The room had grown heavy, as though the air itself sensed what was about to happen. Marcus sat there, hands steady now, his silence no longer the silence of uncertainty, but of final preparation. He had carried this weight long enough, and tonight he would lay it down in front of them all. The dinner conversation faltered into awkward pauses. Claire's brother cleared his throat. Her mother forced a smile. Her father sipped his wine with the impatience of a man who disliked disruptions. Everyone sensed something was coming, but no one knew how deep the cut would be. Marcus finally lifted his gaze. His eyes swept across the table, stopping briefly on each face, lingering on Claire last. But the flicker of panic in her eyes told him she knew the storm had arrived. With a calmness that surprised even himself, Marcus began. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pound his fist against the table. He spoke in the steady tone of a man who knew his words were heavier than any volume could carry. He spoke of betrayal. Not in the dramatic, sensational way people might expect, but in the raw honesty of someone who had been wounded deeply. He revealed the truth of Claire's infidelity. The late nights, the lies, the excuses. The family froze, forks halfway to their mouths, eyes darting between him and Claire. But Marcus didn't stop there. He went further. He told them what her betrayal really meant, that it wasn't just about stepping outside their marriage, but about how she had done it, wrapped in the very prejudice her family had lived with in silence. Prejudice they had directed toward him for years. Claire's betrayal wasn't simply personal. It was historical, cultural, a reflection of the stereotypes and racism that had always hovered at the edge of their so-called acceptance of him. The table fell silent, but it wasn't the silence of respect. It was the silence of discomfort, of people caught between denial and truth. Claire's face drained of color, her carefully constructed mask collapsing under the weight of exposure. Marcus looked directly at her father. He remembered the jokes, the subtle digs, the way the man had always looked at him like an outsider. And now Marcus laid bare how that poison had seeped into Claire, how she had carried those same prejudices into the most intimate parts of their marriage. "You've all pretended," Marcus said, his voice calm but cutting. "Pretended that your distance was politeness. Pretended your words were harmless. Pretended your silence was neutral. But this," he gestured toward Claire, toward himself, toward the fracture between them, "this is what that silence breeds. This is what happens when racism is left unchecked in a family. It doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys people." The family shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes, others looked at Claire with quiet judgment, but none dared to meet Marcus's steady gaze. Claire tried to speak, her voice trembling, but Marcus's words pressed over hers. This was not her moment to explain away or excuse. This was his moment to claim the truth, to demand recognition of the injustice that had been both personal and systemic. He described the humiliation of discovering her betrayal, not only because she had broken her vows, but because she had done so in a way that confirmed the very stereotypes he had fought against his entire life. Her choices weren't accidents. They were reflections of a deep-rooted prejudice, one she had never confronted because it was easier to ignore. Every word Marcus spoke cracked the facade of normalcy that had held the family together. The elegant table, the polished silverware, the carefully prepared meal, all of it now seemed absurd, fragile, meaningless against the raw power of truth. Claire's mother wept quietly, but Marcus didn't look at her. He knew her tears weren't for him, but for the discomfort of facing what she had refused to see. Her father clenched his jaw, his silence screaming louder than words, refusing to admit what was in front of him. Marcus pressed on. He spoke of years of endurance, of biting his tongue at the comments, of forcing himself to laugh at the jokes, of trying to be accepted into a family that had never truly wanted him there. He admitted his own weakness in staying silent, in prioritizing peace over dignity. But tonight, silence was no longer an option. By the time his words slowed, the weight in the room was unbearable. No one moved, no one dared to breathe too loudly. Claire sat crumbling, her body folded in on itself, her face hidden behind trembling hands. The family sat in fractured silence, their carefully guarded prejudices dragged out into the light. And Marcus. He sat taller than he had in years, but not because he had hurt them, but because he had finally spoken the truth that had lived in his chest for too long. The climax of the night was not in the shouting, not in the chaos, but in the stillness that followed his words. A stillness so thick it revealed everything: guilt, shame, denial, and the beginnings of a reckoning none of them had ever wanted to face. Marcus had shattered the silence. The dinner table would never be the same. The family would never be the same. And he, though wounded, though scarred, had reclaimed something far greater than revenge. He had reclaimed his dignity. The dinner table sat in silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of fracture, of a family staring at a truth they had long buried, a truth now spread before them like shattered glass. Marcus didn't move. He didn't rush to leave or soften his words. He sat still, his breathing steady, his gaze unwavering. For years, he had been the one to compromise, to bend, to carry the burden of keeping peace. Tonight, he had laid that burden down. Claire's family shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Her mother dabbed at her tears. Her father's jaw tightened like stone. Her siblings stared at their plates. They wanted the moment to pass, for the air to clear, for the illusion of normalcy to return. But there are truths that once spoken can never be unsaid. Wounds that once revealed can never be hidden again. Claire sat beside him, her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling. The weight of her betrayal was now undeniable, not just to Marcus, but to everyone around the table. She had not only broken vows, she had confirmed prejudices that should have been confronted, not embraced. And now she sat in the ruins of both her marriage and her family's silence. Marcus rose slowly, the chair scraping against the polished floor, the sound cutting through the heavy quiet like a blade. Every eye lifted to him, searching for what he would do next. Would he storm out? Would he rage? Would he demand something from them? Instead, Marcus stood tall and steady, his presence commanding not through anger but through unshakable clarity. He told them he was done. Done carrying their silence, done excusing their prejudice, done sacrificing his dignity for the sake of appearances. He reminded them that betrayal doesn't only happen in marriages. It happens every time racism is ignored, every time someone chooses comfort over justice, every time truth is buried beneath politeness. There was no shouting, no spectacle, just the calm finality of a man reclaiming himself. He placed his napkin gently on the table, a simple gesture that spoke louder than words. Then he looked at Claire one last time. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a profound sorrow. Sorrow for the love they had lost, sorrow for the life that could never be rebuilt, sorrow for the silence that had poisoned them both. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked away. His footsteps echoed through the house, steady and deliberate, until the door closed behind him. The family remained frozen in their seats, the weight of his words pressing down like a storm that refused to pass. Claire sobbed quietly, her tears falling into her lap, while her family sat paralyzed between denial and the dawning awareness of their own complicity. But Marcus, he stepped out into the cool night air, breathing deeply for the first time in years. The world outside felt different, sharper, clearer. He hadn't just left a dinner. He had left behind years of silence, of endurance, of hidden pain. And though the road ahead would be lonely, it would also be honest. For the first time in a long time, Marcus felt free. His story did not end in triumph, as the world often defines it. He didn't win the argument. He didn't change every heart in that room. But triumph isn't always about convincing others. Sometimes it is about refusing to betray yourself. And that is what Marcus had done. As he walked away from that house, the lesson of his story echoed far beyond the walls of one family's dining room. It is a lesson for anyone who has ever been told to stay silent in the face of injustice. A lesson for anyone who has endured the small cuts of prejudice dressed as politeness. A lesson for anyone who has sacrificed dignity for the sake of peace, because peace without justice is not peace at all. It is only silence. Marcus's story forces us to confront a painful truth. Racism does not always wear the face of hatred. Sometimes it hides behind smiles, behind family dinners, behind the illusion of civility. Sometimes it sits quietly at the table, unspoken but deeply felt, until someone dares to shatter the silence. And when that silence is broken, everything changes. So the question remains: what silences are we still keeping? What truths are we still burying for the sake of comfort? And what will it cost us and those we love if we never find the courage to speak?